Alright everybody, so here we go with our Chapter 35 Part 2 video. This is primarily going to be discussing inflation and unemployment and a thing that we call the Phillips Curve. So what the Phillips Curve really kind of tries to do is figure out in kind of a mathematical way the trade-off between, at least the trade-off in the short run, between inflation and unemployment. So you guys ought to remember that when everybody has a job, and therefore, or most everybody, and therefore unemployment is very low, then everybody's got a ton of money to spend, and demand pull inflation is pretty likely to follow. Now remember that what the Fed is trying to accomplish, and really everybody's trying to accomplish, is low inflation, low unemployment, right, keeping it at that natural rate, and then full production. Now the compatibility of those things becomes the question. Now we assume that the primary problem from a cost push inflation standpoint are supply shocks, okay? And that's going to cause both unemployment and inflation to rise. And then we're going to see that in the long run there isn't really a trade-off. In the short run there is, but in the long run there is not. That's going to be the results of our discussion of the Phillips curve. So you see aggregate demand, and as we notice aggregate demand increasing, we see that we get additional quantity, but we pay higher prices for it. And then we get more and more. Whoops. And what you'll notice is we have larger increases at the beginning, increases in quantity, with smaller increases in price. But then as aggregate supply starts to steepen, we get smaller increases in quantity and larger increases in price. And this should probably make sense approaching a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. We know that in the long run, additional demand is just going to be sucked up through changes in price because we can't produce more than we can produce in the long run, right? We can only produce on our production possibilities curve. So where this really kind of comes from is empirical data from the 60s. So imagine you're in the 60s and you've got all of these years, right? What you see is when the unemployment rate is high, the inflation rate is low. And when the unemployment rate is low, the inflation rate is high. And then there's a pretty clear relationship, okay? And this is kind of what people were sort of assuming was this relationship would look like. Okay, and it makes good sense. It stands in the reason that stands within the reason that we've always discussed. There's our line of best fit. Remember that this isn't a function; it's just a line of best fit based on the empirical data. So in the 60s, we believed that the trade-off was stable and predictable. That's what eventually becomes problematic, the idea of it being stable and predictable. But we've noticed instead that the Phillips curve shifts over time, and on the next slide you're going to see that. Supply shocks are going to be the big difference, though. We saw it when oil prices went up, and then we have the introduction of the concept of stagflation, which eventually is going to go away over the course of the 80s as interest rates and therefore inflation rates fell. So in the long run though, and we're going to demonstrate this graphically, we don't think that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the short run there is, and in expected inflation, that's the idea that we can cause inflation by thinking that it's coming. For example, if you think prices are going to rise in the future, then you'll run out and buy things now at the current lower prices. And that increase in aggregate demand actually winds up causing inflation. Okay? The idea of disinflation is not deflation. Disinflation means a slowing of the inflation rate. So if we have an inflation rate this year of 5% and an inflation rate next year of 3%, so 5% in year one and 3% in year two. That is what we call disinflation because inflation is still rising. 3% is still an increasing inflation rate, but it's increasing more slowly, okay? So when we go from year one to year two, that decrease in the inflation rate, that is what disinflation is definitionally, okay? So we've talked about that before, but just keep that in mind. So here are what we see those supply shocks do. When we have a negative supply shock, we see a rightward and upward shift away from the origin, okay? And then positive supply shocks, that would give us leftward and downward shifts back toward the origin. Okay, so this is going to be adverse, and this will be a positive supply shock. And we have some positive supply shocks. In class, we talked about the fracking boom and how that is a positive supply shock from the perspective of energy prices. If there were a massive, technological advance in solar or something like that, then that would also give us a positive supply shock. Skip that one. So here, let's look at a Phillips curve. So remember, this is strange because we have the unemployment rate here, and since a lower unemployment rate is the, air quotes, more positive thing, we have to shift ourselves. In the majority of our both micro and macroeconomic talks, when good things happen, we see that as a shift out and to the right for the majority of time as a rule of thumb. But now we're seeing the better thing, low unemployment, as movement left along the Phillips curve. So instead of making it, kind of shift like this, it's just downward sloping. So that's just fine. We don't have to worry about that. There we go. We'll get rid of that extra line. Okay, so in the long run, we have our long run Phillips curve, which is what we're constructing here. Because what we see is when things get positive, okay, we have an increase in inflation due to all of the extra people who are employed as we move below the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so for a brief period of time, we have output prices rising and businesses are able to capture that as higher profits. Those higher profits then allow them to hire more people. But of course, eventually nominal wages catch up, right? Everybody who's working in that business knows that their labor is very valuable, so they have strong negotiating power. So of course they negotiate, nominal wages rise, other input prices rise, and then we wind up pushing back here to a new Phillips curve, okay? So that's where we wind up, okay? And we see the same thing sort of happening kind of no matter where we are. Of course, it can happen in the opposite direction as well. Output in a recession, when unemployment goes high, all of your input prices are typically more fixed. So in the long run, you can drop your output prices. That's going to show up as negative profits or smaller profits, which then incentivizes businesses to cut workers or over time not give wage increases, which then means that nominal wages will fall and we'll wind up back where we were, same way. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about taxes and aggregate supply. Some of you might be familiar with the term supply side economics. This became very popular during the Reagan administration. And the idea is that the government uses one of its major arsenals, which is taxes, to incentivize people to work and to incentivize businesses to expand and invest and all that sort of thing. And this is really about, this really shows up in the Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer is a pretty big deal economist. If you pay attention to conservative media, you will see him. He's considered kind of a kingmaker in the Republican Party. He's a big deal. So let's learn about his little curve here. So we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but conceptually you can sort of imagine if the government has a 0 tax rate, then they will earn no revenue, okay? And if they have a 100% tax rate, they will earn no revenue. If they charge 100% of taxes, nobody would do any work. And if they charge 0% taxes, then it wouldn't matter whether anybody did any work because they wouldn't get any revenue. But then, of course, there is a point in the middle where there is some level of taxes, right? There's a tax rate that maximizes revenue, which gives us a curve. Okay, now whether this curve is shaped, like this parabola, who knows? Most people think that it probably looks something more like that, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. What matters is there is a point which we call point M, which is where tax revenue is maximized. There is a tax rate at which tax revenue is maximized. And if you are above that, then by lowering the tax rates, you will actually increase tax revenue. And therefore, if as a politician or economist or whatever, you could prove that we were at a point like N on the Laffer curve, then by lowering taxes, you'll actually create more tax revenue. Of course, if you're at point L, then lowering the tax rate further would further decrease tax revenue. Now, some people think that that's okay too. They think that, making the government small, the best way to do so is by starving it of revenue. And, ideologically, some people feel that way, and that's certainly up to them. So really the question is, are we at a point like N, M, or L in our current situation? And I mean our current situation, not just today, but in any time when anybody is trying to make decisions, where are we? Are we at N, M, or L? If we're at N, then there's a really good argument to decrease taxes. If we're at M, then we want to stay where we are. But of course, how do we know? And the answer is very unclear. Most contemporary economists will tell you that we are somewhere in this neighborhood of tax rates. Almost nobody thinks that lowering taxes is actually going to increase tax revenue. And we've seen this in various state experiments and experiments in the federal government as well. So you'll hear the argument all the time, but most contemporary economists will tell you, Arthur Laffer is not one of them, but most contemporary economists will tell you that if we decrease tax rates, we will decrease tax revenue. Once again, maybe that decreasing tax revenue isn't bad, but most will tell you that that will happen. So, of course, there are other reasons for the criticisms as well. So, time is the big thing. If we have higher growth rates, then we may push to inflation. We may wind up with higher real interest rates, and those real interest rates then serve as a disincentive, for businesses. So you can argue for low rates but higher taxes, and it's access to money versus paying taxes. It can kind of cancel itself out a little bit. And then obviously we already talked about the possible criticism of where we are on the curve. So there's lots of things there, but as people who are trying to be educated members of society, it's an important thing to be able to consider the Laffer curve and the ideas underlying it if you're going to get involved in discussions about taxes and how taxes do or do not incentivize work, savings, investment, growth, etc. All right, so we're not going to worry so much about this. And yeah, so you can see that positive output shocks are going to raise tax revenues. That's what most people would say happened during the Clinton administration when we had, the big budget surpluses, that it was less about, good policy and more about just positive supply shocks and output shocks because of, just a really raging economy in the internet age. So that's you can read through this, pause it if you like, but for the most part, that's where we're going to stop on chapter 35. So thank you very much, guys. Have a good one.